All right, let's go. It's 11:01. We'll get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for probably the granddaddy of them all, one of the more exciting, always well-attended webinars that we do, called F&B management agreements. We love F&B management agreements because they are money makers. It's always nice to enter into a contract where you're pretty much guaranteed to make some money. And that's what F&B management agreements do for restaurateurs. With us today, my partner, the chair of our corporate group, the nicest man in the legal hospitality business, and also the toughest at the same time, Andrew Fine. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for joining us. On the ones and twos always is Alex Randrup, who's our client service director. Is that how we say it now? Yeah, okay. She takes care of all of our marketing and all of our clients. Thank you for putting this together for us. I think we're ready to get started. So we're going to launch into it, ladies and gentlemen. F&B management agreements. Okay. Let's go. Legal disclaimer. What we're going to tell you today is going to be scintillating. It's going to be so interesting. You're going to learn so much, but it's not legal advice. So if you need legal advice, call us. Call Andrew, call me, send us emails, and hire us, and we'll give you some legal advice. Next. So let's start with what is an F&B management agreement. Andrew, you want to take us through your understanding? Give us the broad strokes of legally what is an F&B management agreement, or just philosophically what it is?
Sure. Simply put, it's a deal between a real estate owner and a hospitality manager, right? A manager is engaged to run one or a series of F&B spaces or outlets as something very specific. Usually the manager is very carefully targeted by the owner to run a certain outlet in a very specific way. F&B management agreements are fun because they're kind of a hybrid of an equity deal where, maybe a landlord would actually invest in a tenant entity and become a partner in the tenant entity and sit on both sides. And a lease deal where, it's kind of more of an arm's length transaction between a landlord and a tenant, where the tenant basically just pays rent. And the amounts that the landlord receives are fixed based on that rent schedule. So, there are a lot of different iterations of these, but the nice thing about F&B hospitality management deals is that they tend to follow very similar structures, regardless of whether you're doing a deal for a single restaurant, if you're doing a deal for multiple outlets within a hotel, a deal for a movie theater, a golf course. There are lots of different iterations of these, and admittedly, there's lots of variance between them, lots of potential variance. But they all follow.
Andrew, let's talk about the types of spaces. I'd love to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I love you, but sometimes I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What types of spaces are we talking about when we talk about F&B management agreements, and some developer or owner of something wants to hire us? What kind of spaces are they usually trying to fill?
It's a good question. 5 years ago, I'd say that F&B management agreements were predominantly featured in hotels, right? You have a lobby bar, you have a restaurant, maybe you have a rooftop, you have a couple outlets within a hotel that makes sense for an F&B management agreement. What we'll talk about in this series, in this webinar, is kind of recent trends that we're seeing. We see F&B management agreements growing in popularity for a lot of reasons. And over the years, we're starting to see them more frequently for maybe more non-traditional outlets, right? Like, for example, golf courses, movie theaters, even just private event spaces and other things. I think owners are tending to really like F&B management agreements as a tool to get very specific talent to create high-level F&B services that's going to ultimately function as an amenity for something else, for part of a larger project.
Because they're real estate guys. So everything that they do in life is based on a spreadsheet. Everything they do in life is about profits. So they're not looking to you because they think it'll just be an amenity and aren't I a nice person. They're looking to our operators because they're going to be able to charge more per square foot in their retail spaces, in their office spaces, in their condo, whatever it is. So it makes them money also. How do you find these deals, Andrew? So I would love to do an F&B management agreement. I've got a restaurant, it's doing well. How do people even find these?
Yeah, because the managers that are tapped for these are tapped very deliberately. Usually developers and owners approach restaurants with this idea, right? That when they're creating, a concept for a hotel or a mixed use building, they may envision some, French cuisine on the corner, and they're going to look around and say, who do we think would be a good operator? Who's proven that they can do it on their own? And a lot of our clients who have success in this are approached directly or indirectly by real estate owners and developers who like the concept that exists already, who have the proof of concept, who have kind of the notoriety. So we always congratulate clients when they are presented with a term sheet for a management deal, because to some degree that is an endorsement of the brand and reputation they've built already. People who are just starting out in hospitality typically aren't on the radar for these types of deals, at least for the larger projects. Brokers can be involved too, right? If you're working with a real estate broker who knows a lot of developers, they may help integrate you into that conversation. But usually it's not, you contacting a landlord for a lease. It's usually the other way around in a management deal. Usually the owners are meeting and figuring out who would be a good space, who would be a good fit for the space.
Owners hire consultants typically. Rockefeller Center is a good example. They hired Keith Durst, who went around and he knows everybody in town and put together a great group of restaurants. But get to know the consultants. There's Keith Durst, there's Peter Peterson, two guys we work with pretty often who have done great things for our clients. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about the skeleton of the deal, Andrew, and tell us what's included. How are we even looking at these deals when we start having our first conversations with somebody? Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are just basically, a few key points that come to mind when we talk about a management deal and when we try to differentiate a management deal from, a joint venture or co-ownership contract, for example, or a lease on the other hand. These are kind of some points that, in our opinion, really help distinguish and define what a management deal is and should look like. There are times where we'll see a term sheet that says management deal, but we'll dig into it and say, this is really a lease. There are times where we'll get a term sheet for a lease and we'll look at the terms and say, this is really a management deal. So it's not, what isn't as important is what the term sheet or the contract says. What's important are the terms that are offered. So this slide is going to kind of forecast where we're going later on in the webinar, what we're going to talk about specifically. Perhaps most importantly are the dollars and cents of it all. There are kind of three buckets of compensation that managers receive for management deals. We're going to talk about them in more detail, but just preliminarily, here they are. The development fee, this is a lump sum. It's typically the money you get pre-opening to compensate you for all the work you're going to do pre-opening. A real estate owner, is developing a concept and they want your advice, not just in what the operation should be post-opening. They're probably going to want to involve you in the design phase. They may want you to liaise with an architect. They may want your opinion on branding and square footage and where should the kitchen start and stop? Where should the hood go?
That's a lot of opinions to build out a space for them.
Exactly. Not to mention, even if it's an existing brand or a new brand that you're creating for the concept, there's going to be a lot of upfront work. You got to figure out menus, you got to figure out pricing and budgets. So there's a lot of work that goes into these upfront. And because the bulk of the compensation you're going to get is expressed as a percentage of both gross revenue and net profits, the development fee is an answer to the question, well, how are you paying me before this place opens? The answer is you're getting a fixed fee. Think of this as not just compensation for the work you're doing, but it's also like a retainer, right? They're paying to lock you into the concept. They're paying to have you on call to answer all the foreseeable and unforeseeable questions that are going to come up pre-opening.
And we're going to talk about how much to charge for development fees in a little bit, but we have been asking more and more because things take longer. So one thing to think about when you're thinking about development fees is always how much time is this going to take me? Because your time is worth something, and that's what the development fee covers, your time and your expertise. What about a base fee?
Yep. So base fee is your bread and butter fee. It's going to be generally expressed as a percentage of gross revenues. So this is just, once you're open, a typical base fee is about 5% of gross. Something that's often confused with the base fee is this is really compensation to the owners of the management group, right? You're going to have an operating budget. Your employees will be paid through that operating budget. This isn't your total compensation that you then have to, pay all your expenses through. This is basically just compensation for the owners of the management team.
All right,
Yeah.
let's stop there. Big moment, Andrew, big moment. You're saying that this money, this base fee, this 5% of the gross goes to the owners. It goes to their bottom line, correct?
Correct.
So they're spending some time on this, even if they have other people spending time on it. Those other people are going to not work for them. They're going to work for the owner. And so whatever happens, if you've got a bunch of different deals and you got a bunch of base fees, that's money in your pocket.
Yep.
Okay.
And the incentive fee is just a term for basically a profit share, right? We'll get into how this is typically structured in a little while, but we basically wanted to outline the skeleton so that you know that there's pre-opening fee, there's a base fee based on revenue, and there's an incentive fee based on profits. So there are 3 buckets of compensation that typically define these deals. And we would, say that any deal would be incomplete without one of these. We sometimes see deals that don't have development fees. We sometimes see deals that don't have incentive fees. Those happen, but they're very unusual. So, these are really kind of defining characteristics of these deals, regardless of whether it's for a single restaurant or a hotel with 8 F&B outlets or a golf course or a movie theater, what have you. It's very common to have all 3 of these categories represented. Another central feature is, and one of the reasons managers love this type of deal so much, is this is ultimately an engagement of services. So the owner is investing its own capital into building out the space, right? So you're not coming out of pocket for any kind of renovation or build out or working capital in the way that you would if you were signing a lease with a landlord.
Are you coming out of pocket for anything or pretty much nothing, right?
Typically not, right? The idea is you can get fired from a management deal. We'll explain what that looks like and what is fair and what isn't. But at the end of the day, you don't have any continued interest in the space if the space isn't performing within certain variances of what you're projecting. So it wouldn't really make sense for manager to invest in a space that it doesn't have some kind of guaranteed continued ownership in. With a lease, as long as you pay rent, you have that space, right? There are obligations in the lease of what you can't do, but it doesn't matter whether you're paying rent from your personal assets that the business is doing well or not. As long as you're paying rent, you're okay in that space. But a management deal is a little riskier because whether or not that continues really depends on the specific performance of these outlets. So because of that,
you gotta make money for the real estate sharks. If you're not making the money, it's over. There is no crying in real estate.
So we always suggest managers not putting in any capital, and if they do, you have to think about reimbursement, right, or clawback in the event that the relationship terminates prematurely.
Oh, we're not putting any money in. We're not letting our clients put money in. If they put money in, then it's a different deal. It's a joint venture or something else, but we're not going to let them put money in.
Yeah. Collaboration on budgets. This one's very important too. In a management deal, because owner is putting up all the capital, owner is also responsible if there's no money in the bank account for expenses, right? So what owner wants to do is put together a budget and say, look, manager's typically doing all the ordering. They're in charge of, making sure payroll runs properly, all the expenses run in accordance with a budget that you come up with. Usually this budget's revisited annually, but what it means is that unlike a lease deal where the landlord's not really involved in your operations or budgeting at all, as long as they get paid rent, it doesn't matter. Your owner in a management deal is much more like a partner in that they're really going to have their hands on your books, right? They're going to have complete and total access to your P&Ls, to your financial statements, and they're going to be involved in your projections. Your protection as a manager is, well, we're not putting forth the budget unless both of us agree. But one of the defining characteristics of these deals is you have to be on the same page with what is feasible, what the expenses are going to look like, with the understanding that, of course, these budgets are going to evolve over time and they're going to be based on actual data and operations once you open.
This budget process is excruciating, but it is probably the most important piece of the whole puzzle.
Mhm.
I have so many clients who come to me and say, oh my God, I have to go in front of the owners and talk about the budget and have to show them where we are compared to last year's budget. That's always a scary moment because it's very hard to predict how you're going to do. So if there's any advice that I could give people on budgets, it's be as conservative as possible. The more conservative you are, the better. Don't try to impress ownership by showing them big numbers. You're better off being conservative and over delivering. Go ahead, Andrew.
Got it. So the last but not least, the idea of a management deal is, again, you're engaged for management of facilities, but there is a performance element to this, right? Typically, and to David's point about the importance of budgets, after a certain ramp up period, there is usually a performance test that you have to satisfy in order for the deal to continue. If you're falling short of projections in excess of a certain variance, owner can typically terminate the deal. Why is that fair? Well, owner's putting up the capital, it's making a risk. If the concepts are losing money hand over fist, owner is going to have to continue to reinvest out of pocket to keep the space open. So owner needs some protection against that happening indefinitely. So that protection is a performance test, which is usually expressed as needing to satisfy a certain gross revenue or net profit number that's a percentage of what you budgeted initially at the beginning of that year. So, in almost every management deal, there is a performance test and there's a way to be terminated. So there are a lot of pros of these types of deals on the management side. One of the cons is, unlike a lease deal where you can have a 10-year lease with a 5-year option run indefinitely, as long as you're paying rent, not the case with a management deal. Right, you can't hide behind other operations maybe doing well and subsidize rent with other things. Here, it's really just honed in on how are these specific outlets doing.
You got to make it successful.
Mm-hmm.
That does not change. It's the same with your standalone brick and mortar restaurant. You have to make it successful. If you don't make a successful restaurant, you're going to be out. Let me remind everybody, by the way, that if you want to ask a question along the way, you can feel free to ask it in the little chat room. We'll read them if they're relevant and we'll answer your questions. Why don't we go on to the next one? What's the appeal, Andrew?
So yeah, this is an important slide, I think, because owners and managers both want this deal, but for very different reasons. So we often have clients come to us and say, hey, what's a typical deal? What do you see? We want to negotiate a better deal. How and why? And through what angles do we pursue, right, to get better deal terms? In order to do this, you have to understand, what do owners want from this, right? What's motivating owner to come to the table in the first place? Because understanding that really helps negotiate better terms and helps you understand your leverage as a manager. So from the owner's point of view, again, I'm speaking in broad generalities here, but owners look at F&B as an amenity for something bigger, right? So in a hotel deal and a mixed use building, F&B is a way to signal to both their own real estate investors and future tenants, hey, this is a luxury concept, right? We are attracting very high-end F&B offerings, right, as a way to signal quality, luxury, amenities, that's going to end up making the deal more attractive to both their financial partners, to tenants. It's going to help them charge higher rent. It's going to help them do a lot of things.
Yeah, it's going to be in all of their brochures. Every brochure is going to have on the ground floor this cool restaurant because they think a certain segment of their potential tenants are going to like that.
Mm-hmm. And, when we talk about what a development fee range is, part of what they're paying for is the ability to lock somebody in and to put them on their pitch decks to investors, to put them on their tenant decks, right? To say, hey, here's this space. Here's why you should want to pay premium rent on this, right? Here's the foot traffic that we're going to generate. Here's the buzz that we're going to generate through things like F&B and other things. So it creates press opportunities. It makes pitches easier for their partners. And it also, basically just legitimizes the concept and helps crystallize what is often just architectural drawings, right? By having a mood board and a deck and saying, hey, we're going to have this restaurant. This restaurant exists over here. Take a look. Here's the pictures. Here's the team behind it. It helps the concept as a whole really come to life. So owners are very concerned with making sure that they have the right talent there, because that really helps flush out for them ultimately what is the character and nature of this building and larger concept going to be.
And then what? So then they also like the fact that they can make some money. How often does that happen? Do these things ever make money? Do the owners ever get to share in the profits? Do the managers ever get to share in the profits?
Yeah. So, in a rent deal, what owner makes is fixed, right? They know the rent that they're receiving. That restaurant could be the most profitable restaurant in the world, but typically, unless you do some kind of percentage rent deal, if in a fixed rent deal, owner gets the same amount of money regardless of whether the concept's struggling or doing well. Here, there's more of a risk, right? There's no guaranteed minimum that owner is receiving, but there's tremendous upside, because typically in these deals, owner gets the lion's share of the profit until they recoup their initial capital that they invested into the concept. And even after that point, they get at least 50% of the profit typically. So for concepts that are very successful, owners can make a lot of money. Do they, most owners are pretty savvy. They know that, F&B is a risky investment. Are they banking on tons of profit from F&B? Maybe sometimes. At the end of the day, though, F&B is more of an amenity for them that justifies other rents, right? And other more predictable sources of income.
What they definitely don't like that we know, yes, they want to make money, but they hate losing money, and they hate having to continue to fund a project that's a dog.
Exactly. So there is potential upside there. I'd say that, in successful deals, owners can make a lot of money on a management deal, more so than they would make on a rent deal. The downside is the odds of that happening. Who knows, right? I think that it's definitely safer for landlords if they have a mortgage or debt obligations to charge fixed rent through a tenant. It's easier to recover that money than in a management deal. Management deal is usually part of a larger venture.
Talk about the IP. If I open up a restaurant and I choose the name, how does that benefit the owner?
There are different ways that they can structure this. If an owner is going after a brand and say, hey, I really like, David's Bistro, I want David's Bistro here, they're not going to negotiate for co-ownership of the IP, because they're targeting a brand that exists already. Right. What they're really targeting is an existing brand and David, and they're going to use the proof of concept. That's not a co-ownership deal.
So in that case, they get nothing. It's my brand. I'm not going in there and giving them any piece of my brand.
But sometimes they'll say, hey, David, I know you've always wanted to do some kind of omasake concept, but you've never had the capital for it. We really believe in you. Even though this concept doesn't exist, we'll invest in it as long as we co-own it. So that if you expand it, we'll come up with a partnership together, and we'll do that. So we also sometimes see deals like that where the brand doesn't exist already and they're targeting specific talent as opposed to an existing brand. They're in a good place as owners to leverage co-ownership of the brand, because ultimately that's part of their investment. They're investing in the build out of the space, but also the development of that concept. And sometimes for owners, that's the motivating factor. That's why they're going to fork over 7 figures to build out a concept, because they believe this is just going to be the first installment of a brand that maybe, for example, hotel developers want to replicate in hotels.
Yeah, so you'd want to know that early on. You would want to, as you're talking to an owner, try to understand what the future is and what the future plans are for this particular concept that you're putting together. Because some owners are like, it's a one-off, don't worry about it, we're good. Others have 100 locations and they can see expanding all over the country.
Absolutely. Yep.
So the mutual benefits, Andrew, what's the mutual benefit? There's one mutual benefit.
Yeah, I think that, the mutual benefit and what people both understand on the ownership and the manager side is this is a nice hybrid between a lease and an ownership deal, right? It's a little less risky than an ownership deal for both sides because there are ways for typically both sides to get out of the deal if it's not working, right? And this is often a way to explore what could become a longer term relationship. These deals are very risky for owner. That's why they're so selective in the managers that they target. If this works, this typically opens the door for additional deals. We see a snowball effect for these kinds of deals where a manager gets tapped by a developer and the concept works, and all of a sudden now they have 4 LOIs for different spaces by the same developer because the relationship's so important. If an owner and a manager work well together, 9 times out of 10, that's going to lead to more opportunities for both sides. And it saves the owner from having to take risks by going to an operator they may not get along with, or they may not work well with. So these deals are a great way to broker what will hopefully on both sides be a long-term relationship.
Well, that's a good point, Andrew. And it also makes me think that before you get into bed with an owner, you really want to know who they are, what their history is, what their plans are, because if you're working with one, other developers, other real estate people may not want to work with you, or you may not be able to. You may have a non-compete. Mm-hmm. So although it's exciting to be courted and to have a real estate developer say that they want you in their building, make sure you know who you're getting into bed with.
Yep.
What about the manager? What do we get out of this?
Manager, this is a low risk, high reward situation, right? A lease deal comes with a lot of risks because not only do you have to raise the money to open the space, right? Maybe you get some tenant improvement, but it's very rare. You don't have to come up with a lot of money to get a place open. Even when you get tenant improvement and you think that's going to cover X%, you're often, as most managers here know, they're often cost overruns and you're responsible for those. In a management deal, you don't have to worry about that. If the concept costs more than the owner thinks it does, that's on owner 99% of the time. So you don't have to worry about raising money from investors. You don't have to worry about budgeting for pre-opening costs and doing all of that. You're going to consult with the owner on those things and help make sure that the budget is feasible. But the risk there is really predominantly on owner. There's also very rarely any personal liability associated with these deals, right? In a rent deal for a lease, there's often a personal guarantee that you have to, commit to as an individual. So if the business can't pay rent, they can come after you personally. That's very risky, right? That's a huge personal potential exposure for you. There's no equivalent concept in most management deals. If there is, I would go as far as to say that it's not a management deal anymore, right? That's more of a lease with certain bells and whistles. So those two are very powerful perks, I think, on the owner side. Another one is there's no guaranteed rent. The general rule is owner gets everything, less what is paid out as expenses and paid out to manager. So if the concept's doing well, owner's doing well. If the concept's not doing well, again, that's a risk for owner. And that's why they have those safeguards in the form of performance tests. Another thing that's a benefit for manager is you get a team, right, that the manager brings to the table. They often have a marketing department that's hyping up the fact that you're part of a project. So instead of hiring your own marketing director, expending your own resources to do things like, PR, leading up to, the pre and post-opening phases, you're often getting an all-star team, right, on the real estate side doing that for you. You may have to liaise with them. You're probably going to have some work on that front. They're going to want to make sure the way they're messaging things aligns with you and your brand. But there are resources that these large developers can bring to the table that not only save you money, they save you time also.
Here's a question from one of our webinar viewers, Andrew. Mm-hmm. Here's the question. Why do I see rent built into management deals in most of the management deals I've read? And I think that's a good question because I've seen them too. Tell us about how you see them, when you see them, why you see them.
So the general rule is everything that an F&B management deal makes belongs to owner, unless it's part of a fee that's being paid to manager, right? Owner gets everything anyway. Sometimes deals will say as part of the expenses that are being paid, there's an assumed rent number. It's often expressed as a percentage of gross revenue that goes to owner. That's just an expense. That's a little different from rent in a typical lease deal, because again, it's often expressed as a percentage of gross revenue as opposed to a fixed amount. And that is baked into the assumed rent is basically the same as your base fee. It's all coming from the same pot. You're getting paid your base fee at the same time owners getting paid their assumed rent. But that's not that owners getting more than they would otherwise get, because the default rule again is that owners getting everything except what's being paid out to manager.
It will affect the bottom line. It'll affect the profits. That's where a manager might feel that because there's an expense on the books. That's a rent expense. That's oftentimes, as you said, a percentage of gross. Maybe that rent is 4 or 5%. But that's an expense. So you take that off the bottom line, and where there may have been $1 million, maybe there's 600,000. It can be pretty significant, but it's a good question.
Yep.
Let's move on to the next one.
Yeah, we pulled this because again, as we mentioned earlier, we've seen these deals gain in popularity in recent years. And one of the reasons we believe that it's become more popular is in the wake of the pandemic, right? A lot of landlords realized, oh shoot, we're losing a lot of money. We have tenants that can't pay rent. What are we going to do if we're gonna relet this space, or we're going to ultimately start over with a new partner? We want to make sure that it's a partner that has the reputation, has the experience, has the expertise, so that we don't take quite as large a loss as we would if we just gambled and put a lease ad out and entertain basically anybody who had the financials to do this. The pandemic really recontextualized the industry, both for managers who were saying, wow, this is so risky. We raised all this money from investors only to have to close. It would be nice if we had the landlord pay for all of that to take that risk off our plate. And on the landlord side saying, man, I wish we could be more selective with who we target, because what the pandemic revealed is the savvy, experienced operators tended to be a little more nimble, right, than the first timers, the people who didn't have as much in the way of proven concepts. So again, what the pandemic did was create an environment where both manager and owner wanted to kind of selectively target each other and say, look, this is very risky. We don't know what's going to happen. The pandemic really shook all of us on both sides. As much as managers hated landlords and landlords hated managers during this time, it really strained relationships. And the concepts that survived tended to be those concepts that had good relationships with landlords, right? And the landlords that had good relationships with managers. So they started to see F&B as more of a partnership than as just an arm's length landlord-tenant relationship. So, that's this article, which we provided a link for, I saw as on my alert, and it was a eureka moment for me, because as much as we negotiate these deals on both sides, it really helped to see direct quotes from managers and landlords agree on this, right? You don't see a lot of landlords agreeing during pandemics, but it was really interesting.
It was 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And we have absolutely see it become a trend. We noted it 3 years ago. And then all we've seen year after year are more and more of these deals. It is now commonplace for every developer to try to find a restaurant owner as a manager. Let's talk about some of the downfalls. And what's the catch, Andrew?
Yeah. So we gave you all the pros. Wouldn't be good lawyers if we didn't give you the full picture. So there are some cons, and these are important to think about when you're negotiating these and even considering whether to pursue them. So let's start with the owner first. Cons.
And don't spend too much time on the owner, because we don't care that much about the owner.
Well, sure, but it's important to understand what concessions they're making so that we can help negotiate, on the manager side. Okay. For owners, they're not getting guaranteed rent. They may get rent, but it's almost always expressed as a percentage of gross revenue. If the place closes, they're not making any rent or any money at all. So it's really important to understand that that's a risk that owners taking. If the concept fails to perform, a lease deal could be more profitable, right? Because they're getting rent, doesn't matter where that money comes from, doesn't matter whether they're paying out of pocket or not. They're getting paid, not the case in a management deal. They don't have the security of personal guarantees. So again, their predictable income stream isn't as predictable. It really depends on the success of the venture. Another con for owner, and something that a lot of owners unfortunately overlook, is it's a lot of work for them, right? They ultimately have to dig into books and financials and projections of F&B way more than they would if they were just a landlord, right? Because the success of this deal lives and dies by the budget, and they potentially have to come in out of pocket if things don't work out. So they need to make sure that the amount they're putting in is feasible, and they have to cooperate and work with managers on these budgets. Experienced owners know this, and they'll work tirelessly for months and months and months on these budgets. Inexperienced owners who are working with F&B managers for the first time typically underestimate how much time this takes and how nuanced and specific F&B budgets tend to be. So we always advise, regardless of whether on the owner side or the manager side, at the term sheet phase, start to put rough numbers together. Because if owner has expectations that are over here and manager has expectations that are nowhere close, we've seen deals get to the 1 yard line, ready to be signed. Legal documents are all done, but they just can't agree on budgets, and both sides are down months and months and months, and X number of dollars in legal fees, only to have financial expectations not align.
When you say sketch out some rough numbers, what do you mean? Do you mean what you think the restaurant could gross? Do you think what it could net? Do you think what the build out cost is going to be? What else do you have to kind of sketch out at the beginning? Gross,
net, expenses. What owner is going to be concerned with are the same things that your investors are typically concerned with in a restaurant deal. How long is it going to take me to recoup my money? Right? If I'm investing $1 million into this project, what are we projecting net profits to be? Right? What are we projecting the expenses are going to look like? Are we going to get more profitable over time? Typically, that's how F&B works, right? The first year is usually a break-even year. Sometimes owners don't understand that, and managers have to educate them a little bit. So, sketch out the rough numbers. Ideally, by the time this deal is signed, you have the first year's operating budget as well as the pre-opening budget done and attached as an exhibit to the deal. That's not always possible, depending on when the deal is signed in relation to pre-opening, but at least a preliminary budget is there to avoid any, last minute disagreements that are just, too large to bridge. We've seen
that budget's going to change a lot. It's going to change maybe even during the course of a year. So do your best and try to find somebody who's done budgets before for these kinds of deals. It's very important. What are the mutual drawbacks?
Mutual drawbacks are the parties have to trust each other, right? You have to trust an owner in an F&B deal way more, and you have to lean on that owner way more than you do a landlord in a lease deal, right? And you have to trust landlords too. Like they're important. They have to be available. They have to make the repairs. They have to coordinate with you. You want to believe that, if a pandemic happens, they're going to work with you. These relationships are important. But with owners, again, they have much more involvement in your day-to-day. They're in control of budgets along with you. If they don't approve a budget doesn't move forward. So you got to make sure that you are philosophically aligned with them and that these people understand hospitality.
So that's why you have to talk to other people who they've worked with. It is so important. Ask a developer for some references, talk to some other operators and ask them these questions. How is it to work with these guys?
And what we find is sometimes partnering with the bigger operators, as much as those bigger operators may not be as open to negotiate certain terms, the fact that they have worked with hundreds of F&B operators over time means that they at least have some kind of understanding of how these deals work. Their expectations may be a little more grounded than somebody who has a boutique mom and pop hotel and are entering their first management deal. Just because somebody owns and operates a hotel or a movie theater or even is a landlord of a restaurant doesn't necessarily mean they have any understanding as to how the industry works or what margins typically look like.
They never have any idea. They know nothing.
Having those conversations early helps weed out partners that are just never going to see eye to eye with you from those partners you want to target who, have a clue or at least have enough humility to defer to you and your expertise as an F&B operator.
What are the cons for the manager?
Ownership's in your business, right? They're going to be annoying. They're going to ask questions. You're going to have to submit reports to them. They may think you're spending too much on certain ingredients. They have a friend who runs that similar concept. They don't spend nearly as much on their GM. Why are you spending so much on your GM? These are the questions you're going to have to field because, again, they have a vested interest in profits. They have a vested interest in making sure that expenses are kept under control. We've seen it time and time again where owner wants high quality. That's why they picked you as a manager in the first place, but they don't want to pay for that quality. They don't understand that certain things cost more necessarily. You have to attract the best talent if they want the best service. So there are often these little rifts that happen, not just for the first budget, but every year these conversations tend to resurface. So, you know, the headache surrounding budgets is very much, very much real. I think if you polled clients of ours who have to say pros and cons of management deals, I think on the whole, they love them. But the con is definitely, oh my gosh, pick the right operating partner who's going to let you do your thing. The existence performance tests are often tough. It makes sense why they're there. Almost every management deal has them. We're going to get into what a good performance test versus what a bad performance test looks like, but it creates a little stress on these types of deals that don't always exist with lease deals, right? Maybe you have a restaurant that has a lease that's just not doing well, but you have a way to turn it around and you're confident in it. If you're not able to pay rent with operations of that, you can come out of pocket. You can get a loan. You can do other things. You can get other funding. You can talk to your investors and pay rent. If you pay rent, landlord's not going to care that you're in the red. But in these deals, after a certain point, they're very much going to care that you're in the red, and they might not have the patience for you to turn it around, or they may leave in your plan to do so. So that's tricky too. Another con is you don't keep 100% of the profits. At least 50%, often more than 50% of those profits are going to owner. You're getting some profits, but you're sharing in that. You don't have as much risk because you're not putting up the capital, but the downside is then you don't get the same returns that you would if you leased a space and were extremely profitable. You're sharing that with owner. And as we talked about, depending on how you structure the deal, in a lease deal, it's assumed landlord has no interest in your brand, no co-ownership at all. In management deals, this is something that's sometimes negotiated, right? Owner may want a right of first refusal on your expansion. So they may want to co-own the brand if it doesn't exist already. So that's another potential negotiation point that exists in management deals that don't in leases.
Let's start getting into the nitty-gritty of a deal and talking about the different fees that our restaurant owners could get from these deals. And then we'll talk about some other things, but let's talk about that development fee, because this has changed over the years. It's negotiated more heavily now, especially with our clients. We're asking for more money because everything seems to take longer. And if it takes us longer and we're not doing other projects because we're doing this project, we want to be compensated for it. So talk to us about in the deal. And when we're talking to you about this stuff, this is for term sheet phase. We're not getting into the nitty gritty, just a little bit of the gritty. What's an owner-friendly development fee?
You know, needless to say, owners don't want to pay a whole lot here, right? Because anything that they pay here is not immediately recoupable. The other fees they're sharing with you, right? So your fees are going to be a percentage of what you're earning. A development fee is just strictly out of pocket for owner, regardless of whether they open, regardless of whether it works. The deal may fall through at the 11th hour, but they've paid this regardless. So they want to pay a low amount, and they want to condition payment on certain deliverables. They don't want to pay you $100,000 at signing and then, you know, hope that you're going to do what you want to do. They're going to say, I'll give you 25% at signing, I'll give you 25% when the menu's finalized, I'll give you 25% here, and I'll give you the rest when it's open.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes they do it monthly also. It's a monthly fee. But also understand, we've had clients go up to the last payment, deliver everything, and then the deal falls apart. But it's not like the owner gets nothing. And this is why you can get paid, because now you've given the owner a business plan basically for a new restaurant.
Yeah. It's very hard on the other two fees that we're going to talk about. We have a much more standardized range for this. Development fee, the pre-opening fee ranges dramatically based on a number of factors. One is who you are, right? The more famous, the more reputable you are, the more you can charge. Because this isn't just, hey, you're going to spend 100 hours on X, Y, and Z, so we'll pay you for those 100 hours. This is a retainer. They're paying you to get your name on their pitch decks, to get your name on their materials. They're paying you for that exposure and that leverage that's going to create for them, for their other partners. We've seen, you know, developments fees from $50K to $350K. We've seen higher than that. It really depends on a lot of things. One of the things that we caution our clients to consider is, when is the projected opening date? How many months of work is that? And what do they expect from you? Right? Some owners want a lot of hand-holding when it comes to budgets and conversations with architects, and they want you to create a new brand. They want you to hire a new team. They want you to be in these interviews. They want you to walk the space. They want you physically present. Other developers are very hands-off and say, hey, we have a turnkey opportunity. Slide your concept in there. There's not a whole lot we need from you. The place is already built. Maybe that's a lower development fee because it doesn't require as much time. So, when we're talking about development fees, figure out how many months you're on the hook and what exactly the owner wants of you.
Yep.
For a manager-friendly,
And in the beginning, when you're new to it, and it's your first one, you got to understand that to make a name for yourself in this business, meaning this development business, this F&B management business, you might have to take less until you prove yourself. Our clients who get 350 plus are proven. They've opened up in other places. They've made money for other owners. If you can show that to an owner, you're in the driver's seat. If you can't, you may have to take a smaller fee.
Yep. Yeah. David mentioned a good point, which is that, a projected opening date and an actual opening date are very rarely the same date. So if you're projecting a development fee for X months of work and it winds up being 6 months more, even if your deliverables are already made, you're still on the hook, right? You're still on calls. You're still going to be bothered. There's still more time. The more delayed the opening, the more you're going to end up working. So we like to put in deals a condition that if the projected opening date doesn't happen and the opening date is delayed, then either there's an hourly rate that they're going to pay you for additional work beyond that point, or at the very least, you're going to reassess what's needed at that time. And before you perform any additional services beyond that projected opening date, you're going to come to terms on what you're going to be paid for, right? So that basically expressing the development fee is, this is what we're getting paid for 6 months of work, or whatever it winds up being.
Right.
Failure to include that means that we've seen clients strung out for years and years while, ownership can't get its act together. There are construction delays, or there are strikes or unionizations. Who knows what might happen? It's very rarely, if ever, your fault as the manager that something's delayed. So
let's talk about,
yeah.
Let's talk about, I'm sorry, Andrew, did you want to finish up that thought?
Nope. That's
No.
everything.
Okay. Let's talk about base fees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is
why do they call it a base? What is a base fee?
A base fee is your post-opening guaranteed amount. You're getting typically 5% of gross revenues to the owners of your management group. That is basically your guaranteed compensation. It's called a base to distinguish it from an incentive fee, which is contingent on profit. A base fee is contingent on gross revenue. So as long as you're open, you're making something.
Right.
A neutral base fee is about 5%. That's what we typically see. Anything lower than that is unusually low. It's not to say that you shouldn't take the deal, but if it's lower than 5, make sure that you're getting a healthy development fee and the incentive fee makes up for it. Over 5, I would say, is rare and generous. We've seen up to 8 on certain deals. 5% is very, very typical though. On the manager side, what we like to do is say that your fee is going to be the greater of 2 numbers. It's going to be the greater of 5% or a certain guaranteed minimum.
Well,
And the reason for that is,
stop there. Let's stop there. That's an important concept. Because again, we're thinking, how are our clients going to make this worthwhile? Because they might go into a year and maybe their projections are off, and maybe they're not doing 10 million, maybe they're only doing 7. So you just said a base fee, you want to be the higher of 2 things, either the percentage like you talked about, or some kind of a minimum. What does that look like?
yeah, a minimum is a floor, right? So if you have projections and you think 5% is going to be, making up a number, 300K, maybe your floor is 250, and say, look, in no situation am I going to make less than 250. An owner has to come out of pocket for that to make sure that happens. Why is this important? The pandemic is a great example, right? There may be closures that are outside of your control, right? That would put a pause on a performance test, right? Because they can't fire you if you legally have to close for some reason. If there's a natural disaster, if there's a pandemic, who knows? It's not your fault. Shouldn't be penalized for it. But ultimately, just because you're closed doesn't mean you're not working and you're not doing things. And in the same way that salaries don't just automatically stop, your compensation, your base fee, your salary, for lack of a better term, should also be subject to a minimum, just to make sure that you're getting paid and that fluctuations in things like seasonality or other things don't wind up, costing more than a certain amount.
Okay, let's talk about incentive fees, because that's always exciting. People get excited by the incentive fee because that's going to be a percentage of the profits. How often do our clients actually see the incentive fee, and how long does it take to get there?
The incentive fee, the reason the base fee is so important is that's going to be your sole compensation for a while, because in most of these deals, owners putting up the capital, right? And it's going to want a higher share of the profits until it recovers the capital it puts in. You'll have a say usually in the development budget. They're going to say, hey, this is how much we're putting in. This is how much the project's going to cost, which helps you project, okay, if we're pledging somewhere between 80 and 100% of profits to owner, how long is it going to take owner to recover that? Because managers' share of the incentive fee tends to kick in a real material way post payback of owner. So that's why, when we see deals and they say, oh, we're not concerned about the lower base fee because look, we're profit sharing. If there's a preferred return, we caution clients against that to say, yes, you're profit sharing, but that's a cherry on top down the road. We need to make sure that the first few years, which are typically the hardest, you have some compensation that's going to make this worthwhile. So, a typical incentive fee varies a lot, but 80-20 in favor of owner is common. Then once they recover somewhere between 60 and 40%, again, in favor of owner, usually owner recovers the majority of profits, unfortunately, in these deals. I think the most generous profit sharing we've seen in F&B management deals is about 50-50. Very rare, rarely more than that.
Owners are taking all the risk.
Yeah.
This is one case where it's easy to justify in favor of the owner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about bonuses.
So we talked about the three, traditional pots of compensation for a manager. There are some other potential deal points you can try to propose at a term sheet phase. You can say that, yes, we're going to get an incentive fee, but we should get flat bonuses if we achieve certain things. Now, these bonuses typically assume that you're going for very high-end establishments, right? We've seen deals where you get a fixed bonus if you win a Michelin star, if you get 3 or more stars from the New York Times, or if you're included in the world's 50 best, and so on.
How much are those bonuses?
Those can be high. They can be $50,000, $100,000 per star, something like that, per year that you win that award. So they can be substantial. How do we justify them? Well, again, it's all about prestige for owner. If they have a restaurant that's a Michelin-starred restaurant, that's driving traffic to their larger enterprise, whether that's a hotel, whether that's a mixed-use concept, whatever the case may be, it's good for them. We often see owners, particularly larger real estate developers, entertain this for that reason. But, if you're going for a fast casual concept, or you're going for a concept that's not really poised to earn a Michelin star, don't even propose it, because you don't want to set the expectations that way. So propose this if you think it's in the realm of possibility. Don't propose it if you don't believe it is.
Let's talk about how long we want to do this, and then we'll talk about all the evil ways that we can be terminated. Why don't we start with length of time, Andrew? Why is that important?
Yeah, so a typical term mirrors, frankly, a lease deal, right? You see often 10 years with a 5-year option to renew. For owner, sometimes they want a shorter term because they want a get out of jail free card if they don't like the way the relationship is going. Owner can only terminate you for cause. Performance is one of those grounds, but they can only terminate you for cause. You as manager really don't want them to be able to terminate for all that many grounds, right? And you want to delay their ability to terminate, particularly for performance in the first few years, which is typically the ramp up period for your concept. So a longer term tends to benefit managers. 10 and 5 is typical, kind of mirrors lease terms. So as you know, you want to lock people into the longest lease you can, because that just gives you predictability. And as long as we negotiate an exit clause for manager, we're okay. It's even better in this case, right, for managers, because even if you're not making money, that's really on the owner, and then you're probably going to be ejected for performance anyway. So you have a lot more leverage to get out of these things earlier as a manager in F&B deal than you do as a tenant in a lease deal, because as a tenant, doesn't matter again how the concept's performing. They have a personal guarantee, they have a corporate guarantee. In some cases, they're getting paid regardless. So longer term, again, typically better for managers.
Let's talk about termination. This is what keeps our clients up at night. When owners come to them and say out of the blue, yeah, we want you to meet with our executive team. It's always the precursor to being put on notice that they may be terminated. Again, if you're not making money for the real estate guys, they're going to call you in. So talk to us about some of the things that we should be wary of when it comes to the owner's right to basically terminate us, fire us, and end the management agreement.
Yeah. So, ideally, an agreement has termination rights on both sides, right? If they're breaching the contract, if you're breaching the contract beyond a certain career period, either side should have the right to get out. You start embezzling from owner, they have a right to fire you, right? You commit a crime, they have the right to fire you. They start doing the same things, ideally, we have the right to terminate too. Those are all very standard, right? Those don't tend to be contentious grounds. There tends to be a very standard list of termination. Where the negotiation more often than not gets prickly is on the concept of performance, right? Let's say you're doing your best and the concept's just not performing. Can they terminate and how? From the manager seat, ideally you want that performance test to be a percentage of the projected revenues for that year. Why do we like that as opposed to just saying you have to earn X number of dollars? Pre-opening, you don't really know what's feasible and what's not. Your annual budget is theoretically going to be tailored to performance for the past year. So, and you have to approve the annual budget also. So by having it be tied to an annual budget, you're giving yourself a little more control as a manager over what the standards and expectations really are. And that's why, again, the budgetary conversations, particularly pre-signing, are so important. Because if you can't agree on changes to the budget, usually what happens is the prior budget just rolls over and goes into effect until you mutually agree on changes to it. So performance test is usually somewhere between 80 and 90% of what you're projecting. But as a manager, you don't want this to even kick in until at least a year or two, ideally two, post-opening. Because you want to say to owner, look, it's going to take me a little while to figure out the rhythm here, get operations in order. First years of hospitality concepts tend to be all over the place. Let's have this performance test kick in year two, so that the earliest you can get terminated for performance is at the end of year three.
That's nice too, because
the end of year two.
and that's nice also because it locks in a couple of years of at least your minimum base rent. So you're going to make some money, but you have to have that ramp up period, because you're going to find, as you know, through opening restaurants, so many things that need to be changed, so many budget items that are different than what you thought they would be. So those first 2 years, you're going to have a lot of budget changes also.
As owner, you want somewhere between 85 and 90% to be the threshold. As manager, you want it closer to 80. I think somewhere between 80 and 85 is the typical range for the variance, right? You can be 15% off goal and still be okay. More than 20%, usually it's a conversation. As a manager, you might also want there to be a rule that you have to fail this test for 2 consecutive years, right? Because if you have one outlier year, maybe it's an outlier year for a reason, right? So having it be an average of either 2 consecutive or 2 out of 3 consecutive is better for manager, because the rationale is it's fairer, right? And assessing, is the concept really performing or not? Owner is going to push back because they're going to say, well, wait a minute, if you get the ramp up and then it's 2 consecutive years, we can't fire you for cause before year 5. We as owner might have to continue to put more and more money in. We're not comfortable with that. There's a lot of variations here, a lot of levers we can play with. We could perhaps say that, if owner ends up having to come out of pocket more than a certain amount, they can terminate, right? To help give you the ramp up you need and give them the assurance, look, there's a ceiling on the cost for you. Another
let's,
concept.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say, switching gears, another concept that often comes up is, real estate owners love to sell their buildings, right? And often they want an ability to terminate with a certain amount of advance notice to open up the possibility that they may sell their hotel in 7 years, right? And they don't want this management deal to prevent that. If we entertain that, what we would require is a hefty termination fee if they wanted to get out. So it's either they sell the hotel and the new owner assumes the same obligations that they have under the existing contract. It's very hard to prevent them from having that ability. It's usually a deal breaker term for owner. So we're saying you can do it, but the new owner has to assume all obligations under this contract. It's not ideal. There'd be a turnover period. It's work. It's one of those unavoidable things. But ideally, you would have the right to get out of it and say, nope, we don't want this to happen. Pay us a termination fee and we'll leave. And the termination fee is usually an average of, the base fee that you've received over the past 12 months or something to that effect. It often scales so that if they terminate in year 2, you're getting a higher termination fee than if they terminate in year 9, based on the benefit of the deal you've gotten already.
Anything else you want to say about terminations?
No, I think most of the people here are probably familiar with force majeure and the concept of, is it your fault or not? If there's a pandemic and another pandemic or another closure and you have to terminate, obviously the termination test is just paused for that point. We put it in here as a thing to look out for, because even though it seems like common sense, like, of course, you can't be fired if you're forced to close, you'd be surprised how many contracts don't accommodate that possibility. So we always want to make sure when we represent managers, and frankly, even if we represent owners, because it's just going to be a dispute down the line anyway, that we're very carefully defining what is an excusable closure, right? What is an excusable pause on a performance test? How a performance test can be modified, if at all, because that just creates clarity for both sides.
Let's talk about a couple of other things. You can give us a minute on each of these. It's our lightning round. Other things to be wary of. Budgets.
Yeah, I think we've kind of talked this one to death already. Budgets they keep coming up because they are so important. Most of these deals, we've negotiated deals for over a year that have fallen apart at the finish line because of budgets. Again, the lawyers can do only so much to get the deal in line. If the finances aren't lining up and the expectations aren't aligned, the deal's never going to get signed. So have the conversation early, make sure that you trust the financial analysis that they're running, and make sure that you're speaking the same language with respect to expectations. So make sure that the budgets are talked about and that you have to pre-approve any budget of any kind, pre-opening or post-opening. Make sure you're involved in that.
About non-competes.
Non-competes are self-explanatory. Owners sometimes want to restrict managers' ability to either operate other ventures in a proximity of this one. They may not want you to work with certain hotel brands if you're locked into one hotel brand, or certain developers if you're locked into this one. I say be wary of them because this is something that should ideally be talked about at the term sheet phase. This is one of those things that sometimes pops up way later than we feel like it's appropriate. Ownership will ambush us in a long form document with a really restrictive non-compete that puts manager in an instant default because maybe they're already operating other concepts that violate that non-compete. So if you're talking to owner, make sure you ask the question and make sure that that's in the term sheet if they do expect any kind of restricted covenant to that effect.
What about exclusivity clauses?
Same mindset, right? They may say, if you're working with us, we don't want you working with any other hotels. If you're working with us, we don't want you operating any other golf courses. If you're working with us, we don't want X, Y, and Z. Sometimes that's okay, depending on what your goals are. Sometimes it's worth it, as David was saying, to get your foot in the door of these management deals. Maybe you really believe in this partnership with owner. We've seen deals signed with exclusivity clauses, but just make sure you know what you're going into so that you're not surprised by that and turn forward the document.
What's a key person clause?
Key person clause is basically owner's way of making sure that if they're hiring a management company, they're getting the direct involvement from the owners of that company. Right? They're not just hiring the company, they're hiring the very specific people behind it. So sometimes owner will say, we want this chef physically present 40 hours a week for the 3 months before and after opening. And depending on who the chef is, that may or may not be feasible. right, with their other obligations, and understanding what the in-person attendance requirements are, the in-person meetings for certain people. It's really important to have an understanding of early, because again, we've seen deals fall apart in later stages because they just do the math and realize, wait a minute, if I have to personally be here, it's not going to work because I am in Tokyo that week, or I am not going to be around, or I can't do this. And sometimes for owner, that's important enough for them to walk away from deals. So making sure it's understood not only what the in-person attendance requirements are, what the training requirements are, but who can do them. Does it have to be this person, or can it be someone they appoint? Do you have to agree on the person who's training the executive chef, or can managers just appoint that person, and can they do it on the basis of trust? All things.
And lastly, the always naughty non-solicitation clauses. What's that about, and why do they care?
Typically non-solicitation clauses are very standard, right? They say that, you as manager are not going to poach hotel employees, and hotel employees are not going to poach your employees, and you're going to respect each other's relationships. And it often extends beyond employees. It talks about vendors and, any commercial relationships that you have already. The reason that this can sometimes be tricky in a management deal is sometimes you're saying that owner is hiring all the staff, right? Sometimes manager does, sometimes it's owner. It really comes down to which entity is going to be insured for it, and which entity has the responsibility of coordinating things like payroll, onboarding, hiring, firing, disciplining, all that stuff. A lot of times it's manager, right? Because owner just wants it off their plate. Sometimes it's owner because they're saying, look, we want to run all payroll for the hotel through the same place, including F&B. If you are bringing a team over that you already have a relationship with and saying, that's okay, that can be hired by owner, and then let's say in year 5, it doesn't work out and you want to walk away, technically, you can't bring those employees with you under non-solicitation rules unless you contract for that specifically, right? Because now they become owners' employees, and they can't follow you. You can't solicit them for a certain period of time. So just be careful with that, because we've seen some people sign deals without representation, only to have their entire staff, not able to go with them when they leave because of that arbitrary who was the employer. Technically, it was manager overseeing them and working with them day to day, but it's easy to lose sight of those details in a contract sometimes.
Well said, Andrew. In fact, all of it was well said. And now we come to the portion of the webinar, which is everyone's favorite, and that is the questions and answers. So now is when you can start typing your questions into the chat box, and we will answer them. Andrew and I have done together hundreds of these deals. We continue to do them. We can answer your questions. You can get granular with us. You can keep it high level. It's really up to you. But we would like to see some questions. And in fact, if we don't see any within the next minute or so, we're going to end the webinar. So I don't know, Andrew, how are things going in corporate while people are writing their messages to us? How's the corporate world of restaurants these days?
Good. It's very busy. Institutional money is sitting tight, but you don't see a lot of institutional money in bar and restaurant deals typically. Friends and family deals are alive and well. We're definitely seeing more concern over brand than we have before. I think the pandemic really shifted people's mentality. People want to take advantage of economies of scale. So whether it's a management deal or a lease deal where you're raising money for investors or whatever the case, investors and managers care a lot about the brand and who owns it, because they're not just concerned about, hey, how is this restaurant going to operate? They're going to say, okay, let's assume it's successful because I'm investing on that basis. What's your plan for locations 2 through 10?
Right.
So we see a lot of negotiation hinge on things like intellectual property, hinge on things like expansion, preemptive rights, participation, that kind of thing.
Someone asks, how does one find opportunities and how do you become a manager? Well, you find the opportunities by building yourself a restaurant and getting known. You're not going to be able to do anything unless you've got a home base. And then you can go to the consultants and the real estate brokers and get in front of the developers and pitch yourself. That's how you start. But let them know, let these consultants know that you're available. But first, you got to open up a restaurant and create a brand and create some desire to have you be part of a deal. And then becoming a manager.
Right. Go ahead.
Becoming a manager, it's really just getting the deal and then signing the deal, and then you're a manager. So you were a restaurant owner, now you're a manager of an F&B management deal. It's as easy as that.
And when you're working with these brokers and consultants, once you have kind of proof of concepts for an existing concept you own, think about, what kind of developers would make good partners? Where do you think your concept would succeed? Right? Some concepts are good for, upstate B&Bs. Some concepts are good for, Marriott hotels in Times Square. Some concepts are good for, grab and go or deli concepts adjacent to a mixed use building. Think about where your brand might fit in, because that'll help narrow the search a little bit and give yourself not just hey, I'm a manager, I want any developer use me. Like have an idea, have an angle to say, hey, here's the value add I think I could bring to a larger concept. Here's where I think my niche is. Here's where my clientele tends to be. And here's where I think I would be a useful partner to a larger operator.
Here's another question. If a business incurs net losses for the first year or two of a management deal, is it common for future profits to be used for reimbursement of those losses to the owner before the incentive fee profit share kicks in? Or are there cases where those losses don't carry over and they are absorbed directly by the owner in each respective year? And once the business turns profitable, it immediately kicks off the profit sharing.
It's much more common for owners to get a preferred return. If they come out of pocket 100K, they get priority in profits until they're recouped. That's almost always how it works. I've seen deals where that's not always the case. Frankly, I think that's more a product of owner having bad counsel and missing it than that actually being a thought out outcome. It's almost always the case that if owner has to come out of pocket, that priority return is extended by the amount that they come out of pocket. So if their initial budget is 1 million and the profit share says they're going to get, the vast majority of profits until they recover 1 million, that 1 million target may increase by the amount that they have to come out of pocket over time.
Mm-hmm. I think that wraps it up for us. Thank you all for attending our webinar. We have some more coming up. What's the next one, Alex?
Raise money and pitch investors on December 4th.
November 4th, how to raise money and pitch investors, again with the Andrew and David show. Happy holidays, everybody. Safe travels. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.